Wow, family, listen carefully. You are the first woman who made this man stop, not just stop talking, not just stop running, not just pretend everything was fine. You made him stop inside. And if this message resonates with you, take it to God in prayer and use discernment, because there is something deeper here. Something about you confronted a pattern he had carried for a long time. Oh yes, before you, he could move on quickly. He could convince himself another person would come, another connection would appear, another door would open, but then you came into his life, and suddenly, moving on did not feel so simple anymore. Family, look at this Six of Swords reversed, not as fortune-telling, not as a promise about somebody's private thoughts, but as a symbol, a picture of unfinished movement, a journey that cannot quite leave the old shore. A person trying to move forward while something unresolved keeps pulling them back. And somebody needs to hear that, because your kingdom spouse may have thought distance would settle everything. They may have thought silence would erase the feeling, they may have thought time would make you ordinary, but something remained unresolved. Oh yes, something remained, and here is where it becomes serious. What affected him was not that you chased him harder. You did not. It was not that you begged to be chosen. You did not. It was that somewhere along the way, he realized you could love deeply and still have standards. You could care and still walk with dignity. You could feel something real and still refuse to abandon yourself. That shook him. Because some people know how to handle pursuit. They know how to handle attention. They know how to handle somebody constantly proving their love. But they do not know what to do with a woman who knows her value. A woman who can say, I care, but I will not lose myself. A woman who can pray and still use wisdom. A woman who can love and still discern, and family, this is only the beginning. Because the moment he realized you might truly keep moving without him, something inside him began to break open. Not destruction. Humility, reflection. Questions, and those questions are what eventually brought him to his knees before God. But what he began asking God, that is where this message goes much deeper. Because family, the first question may not have been, God, how do I get her back? No, it may have been something much harder, something much more uncomfortable. Why did losing access to this woman expose so much in me? Listen carefully, because there is a difference between wanting somebody and being ready to honour them. There is a difference between missing their presence and being prepared to protect what their presence requires. There is a difference between feeling love and having the maturity to carry love well. Oh yes. And family, look at this Page of Cups reversed. Again, not as fortune-telling, not as proof of what somebody is secretly thinking, but as a symbol. A picture of emotion that has not fully learned how to express itself, feelings that may be real but difficult to communicate, a heart that can feel deeply while still struggling with what to do with those feelings. And that matters here, because perhaps the deeper confrontations was not simply that he cared. Perhaps it was realizing that caring was never the whole requirement. You could care and still be inconsistent. You could feel something and still avoid difficult conversations. You could miss somebody and still not know how to meet them with honesty. You could desire covenant and still carry habits that work against covenant. Family. That is a hard mirror. Because your standards may have forced him to see something that attention from other people never required him to see. You were not asking him to perform. You were not asking him to become perfect overnight. You were not asking him to prove himself every second. But you were asking, through the way you carried yourself, for something real. Clarity, consistency, respect, truth. And when you refused to chase those things out of him, he may have been left facing the places where he had been avoiding them himself. Oh yes, because when somebody keeps pursuing you, it can become easy to focus on their desire. You can keep asking, how much do they want me? But when that person steps back with dignity, another question appears. What am I actually bringing to this? And suddenly the old movement stops again. That unfinished energy we saw before, trying to move forward, trying to call it over, trying to make the connection ordinary, but something inside keeps returning to the lesson, not because you are supposed to put your life on hold, not because you should assume every silence means somebody is secretly transforming, but because sometimes a meaningful connection exposes what distraction used to hide. And family, there may have been one question even harder than all the others, one question that could challenge everything he thought he understood about love. Had he confused being desired with being ready for covenant? And family, that question changes everything, because being desired is one thing. Being ready to build with somebody is another. Oh yes. You may not have been the first woman who cared about him. You may not have been the first woman who admired him. You may not even have been the first woman who loved him deeply, but you may have been the first woman whose love came with a mirror. Not punishment, not manipulation, a mirror. Family, look at this Queen of Swords. Again, not as fortune-telling, not as a guarantee about this relationship, but as a symbol. A woman who can feel and still think clearly. A woman who can love and still tell herself the truth. A woman who does not have to become cold in order to become discerning. And that energy matters here. Because you are not trying to make him afraid of losing you. You are simply becoming unwilling to lose yourself. There is a difference. A big difference. You could want him without making him your God. You could desire the relationship without worshipping the outcome. You could pray about the connection without ignoring what was actually happening in front of you. And family, that kind of woman creates a different question. Not, does she love me? But, am I capable of honouring the love she is offering? Because attention does not require the same thing accountability requires. Chemistry does not require the same thing character requires. Attraction does not require the same thing stewardship requires. And receiving somebody's love is not the same as becoming safe enough to carry it. Listen, your strength may not have been in withdrawing to make him chase. It may have been in meaning what you said. When you said you needed honesty, you meant it. When you said you valued consistency, you meant it. When you said you would not accept confusion forever, you meant it. And that consistency can be confronting. Because now the issue is no longer whether somebody wants you. The issue becomes whether they can meet you. Whether they can communicate, whether they can take responsibility, whether they can show up when the emotion is no longer exciting and the real work begins. Oh yes, and that may be why losing your attention felt different. He was not simply confronting the absence of affection. He may have been confronting the distance between who he had been and who he would have needed to become to sustain something real with you. Family? That realization can humble a person, because suddenly the prayer is no longer only about getting another chance. It becomes about recognition, about responsibility, about what was placed in front of you while you still had the opportunity to handle it differently. And that can lead to one disturbing question before God. Did I mishandle something I was supposed to recognize? And family, that question goes deeper than jealousy, much deeper, because the first fear may be, what if somebody else gets her? But real reflection asks something different. What if I failed to recognize what this connection was trying to teach me? Oh yes. Family, look at this Four of Pentacles reversed, not as fortune-telling, not as proof that somebody is secretly holding on to you, but as a symbol. A picture of control being challenged, a grip beginning to loosen. Something that cannot be held the same way forever. And somebody needs to hear that. Because sometimes the hardest loss is not another person choosing somebody else. Sometimes the hardest loss is realizing you treated a meaningful season like it would always be available. You thought the door would stay open. You thought there would always be more time. You thought the seed could sit in the ground forever without being tended. You thought the person would keep standing in the same place while you decided what you wanted. And family, life does not always work that way. Seasons move, people grow, doors change, and free will still matters. So this is not saying God guaranteed a specific romantic outcome. Take that to prayer. Use discernment. Because sometimes the lesson of a connection can be sacred even when the outcome is not what either person expected. But imagine the kind of reflection that distance can create. Without your presence there to reassure him, without your attention there to soften everything, without your willingness to keep explaining what you needed, now the mirror becomes harder to avoid. Was I proud? Was I inconsistent? Was I afraid of being fully known? Did I call avoidance peace? Did I expect her to remain available while I stayed undecided? Did I keep asking for patience while giving her uncertainty? Listen, those questions are different from does she still want me? Because now he is no longer measuring your feelings. He may be measuring his stewardship. What did I do with the opportunity I had? What did I do with the truth I was shown? What did I do when somebody cared for me and still required honesty? Oh yes, and that is where the Four of Pentacles reversed becomes powerful as a symbol, because something has to loosen, control, entitlement, the assumption that access will always remain, the belief that you can delay growth and still keep the same door open indefinitely. And family, perhaps this is what finally humbled him most, not that you became louder, not that you threatened to leave, not that you tried harder to make him understand, but that one day, you stopped trying to convince him of your worth. And family, that changed the atmosphere, because anger can still be attachment, arguing can still be investment. Explaining yourself over and over can still tell somebody, I am here, I am still trying, I am still carrying this with you. But quiet dignity is different, oh yes. Not silent treatment, not manipulation, not disappearing just to make somebody panic, something deeper. You stopped auditioning, you stopped explaining. You stopped translating your value into language he could not pretend to misunderstand. You stopped carrying both sides of the connection, and you began returning your attention to where it belonged. To God, to your healing, to your purpose, to your peace, to your own life. Family, look at this Temperance reversed, again, not as fortune-telling, not as proof that somebody is falling apart without you, but as a symbol, a picture of imbalance. Something that has been poured too heavily in one direction for too long. One person giving, one person waiting, one person explaining, one person trying to keep everything emotionally balanced, until eventually something has to change. And perhaps your transformation began when you realized peace was not going to come from controlling his response. It was going to come from releasing your need to manage the outcome. Listen carefully. You did not stop caring because your heart became hard. You stopped overfunctioning because your spirit needed rest. You stopped proving because truth does not need endless auditions. You stopped chasing clarity from somebody who also had a responsibility to communicate, and that can humble a person who is accustomed to someone else doing the emotional work, because now there is no argument to hide behind, no repeated explanation to react against, no pursuit to make him feel secure in your continued availability. There is simply space, and in that space he may have had to encounter himself. Oh yes, his choices, his patterns, his excuses, his responsibility. And family, this is where those knees before God become about much more than romance. Because dropping to your knees is not always about begging for somebody back. Sometimes it symbolizes the moment self-sufficiency finally breaks, the moment you realize, I cannot keep doing this my way, the moment pride runs out of answers, the moment control stops working, and surrender begins. Not surrender to you, surrender before God. And here is where this becomes even more serious. Because when he finally began praying about you, he may have expected the answer to be about how to reach you, how to restore the connection, how to get another opportunity. But family, what if the first thing God confronted was not her at all? What if it was him? And family, that is where the prayer becomes uncomfortable, because asking God for a person is one thing, asking God to expose what in you could not handle that person well is another. Oh yes. Family, look at this Hermit. Not as fortune-telling, not as proof of what somebody is doing behind closed doors, but as a symbol, a person being taken inward, away from noise, away from distraction, away from everybody else's opinion, and into the kind of reflection where excuses become harder to maintain, because genuine surrender can bring questions you do not want to answer. Can you communicate without disappearing? Can you apologize without immediately defending yourself? Can you remain consistent after the emotion settles? Can you protect what you once treated casually? Can you love somebody without requiring them to abandon their boundaries just to make you comfortable? Listen carefully, those are not romantic questions, those are character questions, and that is the deeper issue. Because anybody can pray, God, give me another chance, but a different prayer says, God, show me what has to change in me if another chance ever comes. Family, that is surrender. Not trying to control the answer. Not trying to use prayer to bypass accountability. Not assuming one emotional night means everything is suddenly healed. Because tears are not automatically transformation. Missing somebody is not automatically readiness. And feeling convicted does not automatically guarantee reunion. Fruit matters, accountability matters, honesty matters, consistency matters, patience matters, respecting your freedom matters. Oh yes, because if repentance is real, eventually something has to look different, not just the words, the pattern, not just the apology, the behaviour after the apology, not just I want you, but I understand that you still have a choice. And perhaps that is why this hermit symbolism fits so strongly here. Because there are lessons nobody else can learn for you. You cannot love somebody into accountability. You cannot explain somebody into maturity. You cannot carry another person through a door they refuse to walk through themselves. Sometimes they have to sit with the mirror. Sometimes they have to hear their own excuses without your voice interrupting them. Sometimes they have to ask why something so simple felt so difficult. Because family, perhaps the realization that hurt most was this. You were never asking him to become perfect. You were asking him to become truthful, responsible, present, willing. And if those were the things you were asking for, then why had those simple things felt so threatening before? And family, sometimes the answer is not that somebody did not care. Sometimes the answer is that healthy love touched places avoidance had protected for a long time. Oh yes, because chaos can feel familiar, distance can feel familiar, uncertainty can feel familiar. You can stay emotionally guarded when nobody is asking you to become deeply known, but then somebody comes along who is clear, present, honest, grounded, and suddenly the things you used to hide behind stop working. Family, look at this Ten of Swords, not as fortune-telling, not as a prediction of betrayal or some terrible ending, but as a symbol. A picture of a pattern reaching the point where it cannot continue the same way anymore. Something exhausting itself. Something being exposed. Something saying, this way of coping has gone as far as it can go. And perhaps that is part of what happened inside him. Not because we know his history, not because we can diagnose his wounds, but because sometimes fear of vulnerability looks like withdrawal. Sometimes fear of inadequacy looks like inconsistency. Sometimes attachment to control looks like emotional distance. Sometimes people leave before they can be fully known, because being known feels more frightening than being alone. Listen carefully. Understanding that does not erase responsibility. A wound can explain behaviour. It does not automatically excuse behaviour. Fear can explain why somebody struggled to show up. It does not mean you were required to accept whatever that fear produced. And this is where your role becomes important. You are not his healer. You are not his rescuer. You are not responsible for carrying him into maturity. But perhaps your presence became a mirror, because you stopped participating in the old cycle. You did not keep making confusion comfortable. You did not keep rewarding distance with more pursuit. You did not keep sacrificing your peace, so he would never have to confront himself. Oh yes. And those knees before God may symbolize the moment he finally had to face what he had been outsourcing to relationships. His healing, his honesty, his choices, his responsibility to grow. But family, hear this part carefully, because this is where people can get carried away. An awakening is not the same thing as transformation. Realizing you hurt somebody is not the same as changing the pattern that hurt them. Realizing you miss them is not the same as becoming emotionally safe. Realizing what you lost is easier than becoming someone who could responsibly receive another chance. And that difference is where everything gets tested. And family, that test is not about emotion, it is about fruit. Because tears are not transformation. Missing somebody is not transformation. Loneliness is not transformation. Even praying intensely about somebody is not automatically transformation. Oh yes, emotion can wake you up, but character determines what you do after you wake up. Family, look at this Nine of Swords, not as fortune-telling, not as proof that somebody is lying awake thinking about you every night, but as a symbol, A picture of the mind confronting what it can no longer easily avoid. Regret. Concern. Questions that become louder when distraction gets quiet. And this is where discernment matters. Because feeling bad about what happened is not the same as becoming different. Real change looks like honest communication. It looks like consistency when nobody is applauding. It looks like respecting boundaries without trying to punish you for having them. It looks like preparing harm instead of demanding immediate forgiveness. It looks like patience without entitlement. It looks like understanding that you still have a choice. Listen carefully. If this man ever approached the connection differently, the evidence would not simply be that he says, "I miss you." It would be in how he shows up, how he communicates, how he responds when something becomes uncomfortable, how he handles your no, how he handles your questions, how he handles the fact that trust may need time. Oh yes, because the deeper meaning of him dropping to his knees before God is not, "God, make this woman come back to me." It may be something much more serious. "God, change what in me made me unable to honour what I said I wanted." Family. That prayer costs something, because now he cannot perform transformation just to regain access to you. He cannot become consistent for 3 days and call that healing. He cannot say the right words simply because he fears losing you. Real change has to remain even when the outcome is uncertain, even if you need time, even if you choose differently, even if his growth came later than he hoped. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question. What happens if he finally becomes ready? But you are no longer standing where he left you. What if the reason this connection changed him so deeply is that it was changing you too? What if while he was confronting his patterns, you were confronting yours? And family. What if the version of you he once knew no longer exists? And family, that version of you may be gone for a reason. Because while he may have been confronting pride, fear, avoidance, you were confronting something too. Oh yes. You were learning that waiting is not the same as standing still. Faith is not obsession, discernment is not fantasy, love is not self-abandonment, and spiritual hope does not require you to ignore what reality is showing you. Family, look at this lunar eclipse reversed. Again, not as fortune-telling, not as a prediction that something dramatic is about to happen, but as a symbol. A picture of what happens when something hidden begins losing its power over you. When confusion starts clearing. When an emotional shadow no longer gets to define the whole story. And that may describe your transformation. Because there was a time when you may have needed answers from him in order to feel settled. A time when you wanted clarity from his mouth. A time when you wondered whether his recognition would finally validate what you felt. But something changed. You began realizing that your peace could not depend on somebody else reaching the same conclusion you reached. Listen carefully. That does not mean you stopped loving. It means you stopped abandoning yourself in the name of love. You stopped confusing patience with endless tolerance. You stopped calling uncertainty a spiritual assignment just because you were afraid to release the outcome. And family, that matters. Because if this connection were ever revisited, you could not return as the woman who carried all the emotional weight before, and he could not return as the man who expected you to. Two changed people cannot rebuild by recreating the same old pattern. Something would have to be different. Peace, clarity, mutuality, honesty, fruit, not promises without movement, not chemistry without responsibility, not spiritual language covering the same old behaviour. Oh yes. And this is where the title becomes deeper than, "You made this man beg." Because your power was never in making him desperate. Your power was in refusing to disappear from yourself just to keep access to him. And perhaps that refusal became part of what forced him to seek God instead of simply seeking another way back into your life. Not, "How do I make her choose me?" but, "What does love require of me now?" Because if he truly brought this connection before God, one of the hardest questions may not have been about reunion at all. It may have been about surrender, about whether he could respect your growth, your boundaries, your freedom, your right to discern for yourself. And family, that brings everything to one final question. One question that separates possession from love, control from covenant, desire from honour. Can you love her, even if honouring her means surrendering control of the outcome. And family, that may be the deepest question of all, because real love cannot be built on control. It cannot be built on fear. It cannot be built on somebody else surrendering themselves just so you can feel secure. Oh yes, family. Look at this Emperor reversed, not as fortune-telling, not as proof of what God is going to do with this connection, but as a symbol, a picture of control being confronted, of authority without surrender being challenged, of somebody learning that strength is not the same as domination, and that may be where this entire journey was leading. Because perhaps the prayer was never simply, God, give me this woman. Perhaps it became something more honest. God, show me what this connection really is. Show me what I need to change. Show me where I mishandled something. Show me how to make right what I can make right, and give me the courage to accept the truth even if it requires patience. Even if it requires humility, even if it requires release. Family, that is different. That is not possession. That is stewardship. And this is why being the first woman in this message is not about competing with other women. It is not about proving you were better. It is not about winning somebody away from somebody else. No. It may simply mean you were the first connection that made certain patterns impossible for him to keep ignoring. The first one that made running feel different. The first one that made avoidance cost something internally. The first one that made him ask whether wanting love and knowing how to honour love were actually the same thing. And they are not. Oh yes, but hear this carefully. His prayer is not your assignment. His growth is not your assignment. His timing is not your assignment. You do not need to chase proof. You do not need to monitor every sign. You do not need to force a conversation just because you hope something has changed. Your assignment is still wisdom, prayer, discernment, dignity, peace. And if this connection ever comes back around, let fruit speak. Let consistency speak. Let honesty speak. Let changed behaviour speak. Not fantasy, not pressure, not fear of losing what you once hoped for. Because family, if something is truly being transformed, you will not have to destroy yourself to receive it. You will not have to become smaller to keep it. You will not have to abandon your discernment to believe in it. So take this message to God, hold it with open hands, and let peace, truth, and fruit tell you what words alone never can.